Okay. Okay, so I guess we can all introduce ourselves. I'm Izzo, I'm a senior geo major.
I'm Hannah, senior geo major. Sorry.
India, also senior geo major. I'm Abby, I'm a junior geo major. And we all took GY400, an investigation of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. And here we go. So the West Antarctic Ice Sheet is in this map. It's to the left. It's this red area over here. We focused on the West Antarctic Ice Sheet because it's experiencing accelerating mass loss compared to the East Antarctic Ice Sheet, which is in blue, this big mass over here. We mainly focused on the Amundsen Sea sector, which includes Thwaites Glacier and Pine Island glaciers, which are located in here in the super red spot. And it is red because it is experiencing the most ice mass loss out of the whole continent, which you can see also is shown in this graph, like below the map. These red, like the Amundsen Sea sector, is experiencing a lot of mass change. And the West Antarctic Ice Sheet has the biggest potential contribution to sea level change, which is in this graph on the bottom left. If you can see that the purple line is the total Antarctic contribution to sea level change, whereas the green line is just West Antarctica. So if you can tell, it's like a huge contributor to sea level change over the past 30 years, whereas the East Antarctic Ice Sheet is grounded by the continent, and there's not a lot of mass loss change going on over there. Yeah, so that's basically why we focused on the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. It's changing very rapidly. There's a lot of science being done today and every day on the ice sheet. Two mechanisms that could influence the ice sheet collapse or the instability are the marine ice sheet instability and the marine ice cliff instability. So marine ice sheet instability is basically when the ice shelf, which is the part that is exposed, it's not grounded by the continent here. This is the grounded ice. And then this ice shelf is exposed to like seawater. So warm, deep water comes in and it melts the bottom of the ice sheet, which reduces the ice sheet's buttressing effect, or the ice shelf's buttressing effect on the rest of the ice, which moves this grounding line, which is the red vertical line. It moves it back, and West Antarctica is on a reverse slope bed, meaning that like the continent, where the ice is grounded on the continent, gets deeper and deeper. So as this grounding line migrates back, as the ice shelf melts, it just creates more area for melt of the ice shelf. And it's a feedback cycle. So as the ice shelf melts, it reduces buttressing effect, which pushes the grounding line back, which increases melt, which reduces the buttressing effect until the ice shelf collapses. And that's marine ice sheet instability. And then the other one is marine ice cliff instability, which is a bit more of a controversial mechanism for ice sheet collapse, but it's only seen in Greenland right now, not really witnessed or studied on any Antarctic ice sheets. But it's basically when surface meltwater or rain causes crevassing and hydrofracturing on the surface of the ice shelf, along with the warm deep water melting, and the ice shelf will calve off in like giant blocks, which reduces, again, the buttressing effect on the rest of the ice shelf or the ice sheet. And this is a much faster feedback cycle. So if you can imagine, these blocks calve off, there's no buttressing effect, so there's nothing holding the ice sheet like there's nothing pushing back on it, I guess. And so all of these blocks calve off, the grounding line moves back even further, and then it eventually will move back so far that there's an unstable cliff face where basically just the ice shelf is just falling into the ocean because there's no more um, ice sheet to hold it back. And yeah, those are two mechanisms for ice sheet failure.
Okay, so in addition to those two mechanisms that Izzo just talked about, warm ocean currents and a reverse slope bed are two additional reasons why the waste is particularly vulnerable to collapse. So as you can see on the figure on the left here, warm ocean water is shown in pink and is able to access the grounding line of much of Antarctica, particularly in the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, due to warm circumpolar deep water flowing underneath the ice shelf. And as you can see, like along the left side, I guess here, that pink touches the ice sheet itself. So one area at the intersection of the Evanston Sea embayment and Ross Sea is particularly vulnerable to this incoming warm water, which causes enhanced grounding line retreat. The Thwaites and Pine Island glaciers, which are a focus of some of our experiments. A cross section of Thwaites Glacier is pictured here in that second image. And as you can see, the bed topography slopes inward toward the center of the ice sheet, which is a unique feature of the land-based Antarctic ice sheet. The bed deepens inland for hundreds of kilometers, which is not great for ice sheet stability because this could enhance positive ice loss feedback when the grounding line retreats. And so another focus of our work this block was on some data collected on this International Ocean Discovery Program, or IODP 379, which our very young Christine embarked on this expedition back in early 2019. One of the results of this expedition was a collection of these two cores from the Evanston Sea, numbered U1532 and U1533, and those red dots right there, which we've had the pleasure of looking at and beginning to analyze this block. These records from the cores span about 6 million years of time and record ice rafted debris or debris carried over sea by ice, which can tell us about ice sheet conditions at the relative time of deposition. The way this essentially works is that icebergs will break off from the ice sheet in the top right image in the white and drop sediment in class several kilometers out into the ocean. So when we took, or so not we, but when Christine and her crew took those cores on the expedition, they were able to drill several kilometers deep into the crust and then get those records. So here's what some of the IRD looks like in the actual cores in the bottom right image. You can just see those clasts suspended in the sediment. So we got to look through those images and mark the depth and therefore time at which the clasts were deposited. And then we also got to look at these cathodoluminescence images or CL images, like the bottom left corner, which is an image of detrital zircons from one of the IRD class from the cores. So while our findings from this data are still in development and will not be presented today, the data has the potential to align with some of our hypotheses and show glacials and interglacials throughout Antarctic history.
So we used the Penn State ice sheet model for our model experiments. So numerical models like the Penn State ice sheet model use code to essentially solve differential equations in the simplest of terms. They're useful because they can be used to examine the sensitivity of a system to elements that are difficult to measure in the real world or examine the strength of feedbacks. They also can fill in gaps between data points. So obviously when people go to Antarctica, they're not able to go to every single point of the West Antarctic ice sheet because it's difficult to access, and that would also be a lot of time and money. So models can fill in the stuff that you can't visit. So the Penn State ice sheet model is a hybrid ice sheet model, which means that it uses simplified stresses for areas of fast flowing and slow flowing ice, and it doesn't interpolate between them, which higher order and full Stokes, which are just more complex models, use. This allows it to be less computationally expensive and thus be run over entire ice sheets for long periods of time, as opposed to more complex models, which you can just run for a few years and often not on the full ice sheet. So it's kind of a balancing of accuracy and computational cost. And so the Penn State ice sheet model can be parameterized and forced by regional climate pathways and a number of other things, but in the image on the right, you can see it being forced by RCP 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5, 8.5 being business as usual, 2.6 being ideal situations, and that's forcing the ice sheet and seeing how it reacts to those different situations. So we asked a couple of questions in this class. So the main kind of question, one of the main questions that we asked in the class is, when has the West Antarctic ice sheet collapsed in the past and under what conditions? So we used the Penn State model to understand how different factors and forcings influence it, and thus understand how different conditions will influence the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is also known as the WAIS. And we asked a couple of questions. So how can we parameterize this model to match geologic records like the IODP ice cores? How have geologic processes influenced the evolution and potential collapse of the WAIS? And how do paleoclimate models show, what do paleoclimate models show about the WAIS collapse that could be applied to future climate projections, which is one of the reasons why it's important to study Antarctica.
Okay, so the first model experiment was the one I did, and it's what's called a convergence test. So it's a test of how well the model handles under different spatial resolutions. So anytime you set a model, you have to sort of parameterize space in in grid cells. And this model uses like a very set grid cell that is the same over all of the space. And so if you remember what Abby was talking about with computational cost of a model, any model that has higher resolution, so that would be these lower numbers, like 16 kilometers, which is still really, really coarse resolution. But anything that's got high resolution is going to be very computationally expensive. And so that's harder to run over longer timescales or with like certain parameters. And so a lot of times models will run at something like 40 kilometers, especially with this one, which is designed to run over long time scales and continental scale in order to sort of be able to run on a time, like in a week or something. So, and you can sort of see in these two images the difference between what 16 kilometer resolution boxes, so those grid cells, look like versus 40 kilometer resolution. And they're, I mean, you can't really see the grid cells in this left picture, but you can in the 40 kilometer resolution. And so what I did was I compared 4 different resolutions on 2 different 300,000 year runs, one during the Pliocene and one during the last interglacial. One that covers the last interglacial. And so the reason I looked at these two is Pliocene is a warmer, higher CO2 climate. And so we can sometimes use that to apply to future climate models. And then the last more recent timescale, last 350,000 years, is more applicable to like what modern topography and atmosphere looks like. Okay, next. Okay. So these are some of my results. And these top 2 plots show ice volume in West Antarctica over time. The green spans the more recent Holocene, so 350,000 years to 50,000 years ago, and the teal is the Pliocene. And that's 4.3 million years ago to 4 million years ago. And so I think what's interesting here is that
at least in these top two charts, is that the resolution seems to have a greater effect on Pliocene ice volumes than last interglacial or last more recent ice volumes. So you might be able to interpret that to mean that resolution has a higher impact on in warmer timescales, which is an important thing to notice if you're going to try to model the future. And then another sort of interesting thing is these arrows are pointing to spots where I've plotted ice thickness at that time over West Antarctica. And so you can see this is West Antarctica. And Izzo, if you can point to where the Amundsen Sea is. Amundsen Sea, yeah. Yeah. So I guess like the important thing here is that even though this looks like a really small difference in ice volume, the areal extent of ice is super different. And I guess that can, while volume's important for sea level rise, areal extent is important if you're looking at where icebergs can travel if they're racking degrees, so to like where the IODP cores are. Cool. Next, Izzo. Okay, and then, so these are on the right, are sort of time series of height of the ice or ice thickness over at specific points. And so I've dropped those points on this little map over here. So that's Thwaites, Ross, and Whittle. And Thwaites is sort of like has received a lot of media attention recently because of its ice melt. And so that's why that's sort of important. But I guess what you can get out of these is that higher resolutions don't estimate quite as many collapses. So if your models are running at 40 kilometers, you might be overestimating collapse of Thwaites, at least, which is like a smaller ice sheet. So it makes sense that at higher resolutions, it's not modeled to collapse as much because it's sort of got a more complicated, it's a more complicated area when compared to Ross and Waddell. All right, and that's it.
So the Penn State model, the Penn State ice sheet model, can be coupled with a sediment model, which outputs sediment thickness and flux and essentially evolves sediment under the ice sheet over time. And so that's what I looked at for my model experiment. And my goal was to compare the results from the coupled Penn State ice sheet and sediment models to provenance of sediment from the IODP sediment cores that Christine got. So the sediment model is particularly interesting and useful because modeling sediment allows for a direct comparison with the geologic record, because obviously you can find sediment in the geologic record, whereas you just find proxies for ice extent. And also, it's believed that bed topography and landscape evolution are drivers of paleo ice sheets, although it's not super well constrained. This sediment model also hasn't been used super extensively. So it's been used for whole continent evolution over like 40 million years. I think it's been used a couple of other times, but most recently for full continent evolution. And so at super low resolutions and kind of comparing to like general sediment thicknesses off the coast of Antarctica, but it hasn't been used to compare to like specific results like I am doing here. And so with the sediment model, I looked at a few specific times. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but specifically the last interglacial, so the past 600,000 years, the Pliocene also like India. And then I also looked at a period from 2.8 to 2.6 million years, and 5.2 to 4.6, which all kind of span the range of the sediment cores, which go from 6 million years to present-ish, not really, but present-ish. So in the graph on the bottom, you can see grounded ice volume of the model, of just the ice sheet model and the ice sheet model coupled with the sediment model, and it produces relatively significantly different results. And that is probably because the sediment model has a somewhat significant effect on ice dynamics by allowing the basal friction boundary condition to evolve, which is one of the boundary conditions that has a fairly large effect on ice sheet evolution, we think. And you can see ice thickness in the map to the left, and the red arrow points to what the ice thickness, the period that it's showing. So that's a time of low ice sheet extent, an interglacial perhaps. Yeah, so the blue area is where the sediment model has thicker ice, and the red area is where the just the ice sheet model has thicker ice. And so the sediment model looks like it has slightly more impact in West Antarctica and is much thinner in East Antarctica, but that's just an overall generalization from looking at this. So don't take my word for it. Okay. Next slide. So I ran the model at 40 kilometers and 20 kilometers. My 20 kilometer runs finished yesterday. Some of them finished it today at 1 a.m. So that's nice. But I did look at one of them and I compared grounded ice volume of the 40 and 20 kilometer runs. And so as you can see, there is some difference at like interglacials and glacial maximums. However, if you look at the maps on the right, the 40 kilometer ones are the full Antarctic ice sheet, and the 20 kilometer runs are shown by the orange box on the full Antarctic ice sheet. And the white line delineates what I was actually looking at in this graph. And so there are obviously areas that are outside of that. Oh, the white, everything to the left of the white line on all of the pictures. There are things that are outside of that orange box, especially during the glacial maximums that are counted in the graph. So taking that at face value maybe isn't the best idea. And I think my kind of very initial conclusion from looking at this for a few hours was that there isn't a significant effect, at least on ice thickness, of changing resolution, which is good because all my other stuff is at 40 kilometers. Okay, next slide. So the one thing that it might, or one of the things that changing to 20 kilometer resolution might have an impact on is the catchments, or the size of the extent and size of catchments, sediment catchments in West Antarctica. So here I've just included a map again of the IUDP drill sites, and then kind of included where those would probably be in relation to my maps. And I am showing just a rough estimation of Thwaites Glacier catchment during glacial maximum, and then during glacial, during an interglacial. And kind of one of the hopes with the sediment model is to look at the evolution of the Thwaites Glacier catchment specifically. But that's kind of hard to model in a few days, but hopefully that's something that we can do in the future. But looking at it in this way, you can see that it definitely changes. It exists, and then it doesn't exist anymore. And I compared it to preliminary results from the sediment cores so from the sediment core data, we're using thermochronology to kind of identify provenance. So just initial results, we've seen stuff that you see is in the Thwaites Glacier catchment today. That's from Marie Birdland, which is kind of below the red circle, and then like Thurston Island and the Ford Ranges, which are kind of all stuff that you'd expect, I think, to see within the Thwaites Glacier catchment. But we've also seen stuff that we think might be from the Ellsworth Mountains, which I've labeled, that generally during times when the West Antarctic ice sheet is relatively large, including today, I think, flow kind of upwards in this picture because north and south don't really exist. But if you pretend like they do northwards into like the Weddell Sea, but during period like interglacials or periods when the ice sheet retreats, that might change and they can flow into the Thwaites Glacier catchment and then into the icebergs can raft them over the IODP drill sites. And so essentially what we have from the model now shows that that level of retreat is possible. There's a lot of places we can go with this from here, like quantitatively modeling, where the model, when the model thinks that like Ellsworth Mountain sediments could be transported into the Thwaites Glacier catchment and other things like that. But another interesting similarity between the sediment cores and the modeled results is this general trend in sediment volume over time. So the first graph starts at 5 million and the last graph is from 0. They're not like continuous, but just for reference. And you can see a general downward trend in sediment volume, and in the sediment cores, we see a general decrease in sedimentation rates as we come closer to the present. So it's nice to see that consistency between the modeled results and the sediment cores. But obviously that along with specific catchment stuff can and probably hopefully will be expanded upon as we get more results, more like robust results from the sediment cores, and then also maybe do more specific model runs or do more specific analysis of the sediment flux from these model runs. That's all.
Okay, so for my model run, I was looking at specifically the West Antarctic Ice Sheet because of its potential to collapse, but I was wondering about glacial isostatic adjustment and how that would affect the grounding line, because if you see in this diagram, as the ice sheet retreats or even collapses, this entire mass of ice is no longer depressing the continent, and there can be isostatic uplift, which would then push the grounding line in the opposite direction and potentially prevent a total ice sheet collapse. And I focused on the West Antarctic Ice Sheet because it's a lot more flexible than the Eastern Antarctic Ice Sheet. The Eastern Antarctic Ice Sheet is more like a stiff continental shelf, and the West Antarctic like continental base is a lot more flexible. There's a lot more like flux, there's subglacial volcanism potentially, and also the Admin Sea Basin currently has high rates of isostatic uplift. So then here are a few of my model outputs. So I'm looking at glacial isostatic adjustment effect on ice volume. And so what I did, I varied the value or like the rate of change of the glacial isostatic adjustment from 1 to 1,000. And then I ran 8 models. So I ran 4 from 1 to 1,000 and with cliff failure, and then 4 without cliff failure. And if you can see in this graph, when there was cliff failure taken into account, like the quicker isostatic adjustment like had no ice sheet collapse. This is the ice volume. So lower values mean less ice, like therefore an ice sheet collapse. And again, here they're a little bit different. And then when cliff failure wasn't taken into account, there was no ice sheet collapse at all. And it also varied between like the slow rates of uplift or the quick rates of uplift. And to like try to quantify this better, I made a graph of the difference in between the runs from 1 to 1,000. So this red spike shows the red line is with cliff failure and the blue line is without cliff failure. So this red spike shows there's no collapse at 1, but there is a collapse at 1,000. And that trend continues here around like 3.1 million years ago. There's again like the no collapse at 1, but yes, there is collapse at 1,000. But then when we get to the 3.05, there's a lot of variation and the trend actually flips. So with cliff failure, there is like less ice at 1,000 than there is at 1. And then there's a few maps of this. So this is the difference between the rate set to 100 and 1,000 with cliff failure. And if you can tell, it's at the same time. This is the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. And like this is the like height of the ice sheet. So you can tell that there's nothing like this is showing an ice sheet collapse. And the brown line is the grounding line. And just changing the variable to 1,000 shows a little bit of collapse, maybe of the Thwaites Glacier, but not of the total West Antarctic ice sheet. And then again, this is the difference between 100 and 1,000, but this one is the opposite, where at 100 there's little collapse or no collapse, and then when it's set to 1,000 there is a collapse. And basically this is just saying that when it's combined with cliff failure, glacial isostatic adjustment has a huge impact on ice sheet collapse.
Okay, last experiment. We're getting through it. The question that I asked in mine was, has anthropogenically caused radiative forcing caused ocean temperature changes that have thinned Thwaites Glacier? So the way that we went about this task of constraining anthropogenic effects on Thwaites retreat was by comparing 2 data sets on the melting of the glacier from the year 2000 to 2300. Essentially, we scaled the relationship between temperature and melt to determine what was essentially an ocean melting factor, which we then adjusted to low, medium, and high values to see how ice sheet response changes compared to thinning rates from satellite imagery. And then we also did the same for a calving factor, and then used a bias correction approach to narrow down those parameters to the most perceivably accurate ones to run analyses with. So the first of the 2 data sets use data from ISMIP 6, which stands for Ice Sheet Model Intercomparison Project, presumably the 6th one. And this compared ocean temperatures from average ocean temperatures from 1815 to 1880 in one subset, which we called pre-industrial, against average ocean temperatures from 1985 to 2015 in the quote-unquote modern subset. So the model was run with each of these as initial conditions, and then what changed its ocean temperature was applied under newly floating ice when the grounding line retreated. So this first graph in red here in the upper left-hand corner shows grounding and floating ice volume changes. The top one's grounded and the second one is floating. So grounded and floating ice volume changes from 2000 to 2300 for both pre-industrial and modern data, where I think, yeah, pre-industrial is the maroon color and modern is the red color. You can see that grounded ice volume decreases for both, but remains substantially higher for pre-industrial than modern. And then the opposite occurs for floating ice because more of the ice sheet is melting into the ocean under modern conditions, so it has more floating ice. And then this third figure down in the bottom left-hand corner shows ice thickness change over the same period, taken from a point on Thwaites, shown with the orange dot in that top left map. So you can easily see that ice thickness remains much higher for pre-industrial conditions than modern ones. And then on the right side, we have this time series of maps for both pre-industrial and modern data with the years shown above. And you can see how the differences between the two modeled ice sheets increase over time, particularly in the way of grounding line retreat shown by that like tan or gray line. And it retreats substantially further by 2250 for the modern, on the order of like 100 kilometers maybe. And this entire comparison just goes to show that Thwaites responds a lot to human-induced ocean warming due to the difference between pre-industrial and modern responses. Then the second data set used was an ocean global climate model output for RCP 8.5 from a paper we read in class, written by a past advisor of Trevor's. The only data accessible was the RCP 8.5 data, not the 2.6. So Trevor made a makeshift version by looping 2010 temperatures from the RCP 8.5 files, since the two scenarios are nearly identical until 2040. And RCP, if you guys don't know, stands for Representative Concentration Pathway, which is a greenhouse gas trajectory adopted by the IPCC for future climate projections. So RCP 8.5 is essentially the path of least resistance if human emissions were to continue as they are now, while RCP 2.6 is the best case scenario. And unlike the ISMIP 6 temperature data, these are time evolving. So RCP 2.6 evolves for 30 years and then is held constant, while 8.5 evolves the entire time. So these are all the same graphs as the previous slide, and it's kind of remarkable how similar the data turned out, besides the exception of the actual mapping of the ice sheet, which looks fairly different. And besides the fact that this is using future projections as the original data rather than previously recorded temperatures. So the same trends stand where grounded ice volume remains higher for RCP 2.6 than 8.5 over time, and the opposite for floating ice again, for the same reason I stated earlier. And then ice thickness also shows a similar trend where 2.6 remains thicker over time while 8.5 drops to zero, nearly drops to zero from 1750 meters over the course of 250 years. And the maps show similar ice and grounding line retreat pattern, but perhaps more drastic than the ISMIP data. And so what's this all telling us that's different from the last set? As I said earlier, the pre-industrial versus modern comparison shows that Thwaites responds drastically to anthropogenically caused ocean warming, while the differences here between the two RCP scenarios show the wide range of possible responses to Thwaites to human carbon emissions in the coming decades and centuries, with RCP 8.5 being the worst possible scenario and RCP 2.6 essentially being the best. And so this is just kind of cool, but it's something that came out of the iterative modeling process that we went through over the last couple of weeks. These three figures show maps of ISMIP data all at the year 2300, all with the same melting factor, but different Kelvin factors of 1, 1.5, and 2. The initial grounding line from 2000 is shown in black, with the grounding line for 2300 shown in blue. And it's interesting because there's not much of a visual difference between the Kelvin factors of 1 and 1.5, apart from some minor ice sheet retreat. But with a Kelvin factor of 2, retreat gets absolutely blown out. And so I guess this just demonstrates why ice sheet modelers go through the process of running sensitivity studies to analyze and optimize data sets before running models.
Okay, so I know we just threw a whole bunch of data at you guys, but the basic summary of all of it is that one, from my results, effects of spatial resolution may be greater at low ice volumes in warm climates. And so that has implications for modeling future scenarios with warmer climates. And also a side note, that small changes of volume can equate to large changes in areal extent. So that has implications for like where your ice rafted debris are coming from. And two, from Abby's runs, the initial sediment model runs potentially agree with preliminary results from the sediment cores on catchment locations and sediment flux. 3, from Izzo's experiments, warm climate processes in the past can become factors in future ice sheet behavior. So inclusion of cliff failure, so the marine ice cliff instability, greatly affects how glacio-isostatic adjustment could prevent ice sheet failure. And that isostatic adjustment can act as sort of a mediating factor towards collapse. And then B, core data will inform which value for isostatic rebound modeled the best representation. So we need to look at the core data to see where those collapses are and what the best isostatic rebound rate is. And then from Hannah's presentation, relatively small variations in ocean temperatures, particularly at anthropogenic variations, can yield large amounts of change in the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is super important for future models. And then next. Okay, so an interesting note connection between Hannah's and Izzo's presentations, warmer ocean temperatures in the future might affect retreat via the marine ice cliff instability, which can be somewhat stabilized by glacial-isostatic adjustment. So basically what that means is we need to have really good modern values for glacial-isostatic adjustment to sort of pinpoint to be able to model the future. And then we were also able to model Pliocene collapses in 3 of our models. So the only models that actually looked at the Pliocene showed collapses of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And we've been seeing some evidence for that as well in the cores from IODP 379, which is really cool. So I guess like major future direction is a combination of all of these parameters over short high resolution runs, and pinpointing where like specific time scales that would be interesting to look at would be, and trying to adjust model parameters to fit data that we see in the course. Next. Cool. And any questions?
Bravo. Great presentation.
Any questions?
I had one. I just sort of like, it's still stewing in my head, so forgive me if this is like not fully formed yet, but I was just like wondering like what the like how the response time of like isostatic uplift from like melting glaciers that are melting this quickly, like how is that possible, I guess? Like
Let me go back to the slide. Oh, not what I wanted to do. Sorry, one second. Okay, am I sharing now? Yeah.
yes.
So your question was like how fast, or like how does that work, or what was your question, please?
Like I guess like how I'm just having like trouble, I guess. Yeah, what is like the dynamic, like how does the exactly does the isostatic uplift end up stabilizing the ice sheet, and also how does the landscape, or how does the crust respond fast enough to such rapid melting to stabilize, I guess.
So the whole like ice sheet instability has to do with the grounding line. So even just a little bit of uplift will stabilize the grounding line. Let me go back also.
Maybe, yeah, maybe if you go back to the marine ice sheet instability
Yeah.
slide.
And basically, like, the West Antarctic ice sheet is on a reverse sloping bed, so it like gets exponentially more unstable as it like the grounding line retreats down this bed. But even just a little bit of uplift, we're not talking about like huge amounts, but like as this ice sheet as this stops pressing down on the continent, it'll like raise a little bit and it'll be able to like stop the migration, or at least slow the migration of the grounding line backwards to like, it's just like a factor that halts the like feedback cycle of like ice sheet instability.
Right. And I guess like, is there like a lag time between like isostatic uplift and like the fact that the ice has melted off of that spot?
There, I don't know quite
I think
the lag time is, which is why I varied. That was like that was why my experiment was varied from like 1 year to like 1,000 years.
Okay, gotcha.
Blaze, let me share screen
Oh,
for
sorry.
1 minute, and then India, back to you. So this is and I don't want to insert anything other than an observation from geodetic stations that are around the Amundsen Sea. And just a minute, I'm going to share screen. So you see the region that we're talking about? And these arrows are vertical vectors from geodetic stations on bedrock next to the place that's deglaciating rapidly. Okay, there's a lot of scatter in the horizontal, which we can put in another place. But this is a piece that kind of shows why Izzo's investigation area is of really high interest. Prospectively, sites in Greenland could be looked at like this too, but there's essentially real-time measurable response to the changes in ice load around Thwaites catchment. Does that answer part of your question, Blaze?
Yeah. Also, 42 millimeters per year of upward movement is insane. That's pretty fast.
Yeah, so people are pretty energized about this. And, among our group, like she's gotten kind of accustomed to this idea and just saying, well, let's look at what happens because the rock is going up that fast. But it's like a new global standard for responsive lithosphere.
Well, I think, I mean, I have several questions for 400, but I think in the interest of time and getting us all along on this last day, I know my class didn't really sleep, so I'm going to try and let you guys present.